Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this conversation. I'm Shahda Al-Tai, a representative of the Energy Institute's Young Professionals Network, and this is brought to you by the Generation 2050 Initiative. This initiative aims to provide a platform for young professionals around the world to have a louder voice when it comes to big debates around climate change, energy access, and access to energy. Today, I'm joined by Jem Porcaro, who leads the Integrated Energy Planning and Powering Healthcare Programs by Sustainable Energy for All. Jem has been working with governments and their key development partners in Africa and parts of Asia to improve energy security and energy access for the healthcare sector. Jem, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks, Shahada. It's great to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Jem, can you please start by describing for us the critical role that electricity plays in supporting the healthcare sector? And maybe elaborate a bit more on the key challenges that we faced over the past year because of COVID-19.
Sure. It's a really important and timely question. These two large, vast, complex issues of energy and health are actually rarely talked about together, even though the way that we generate and consume energy has a huge bearing on our public health. And one of the ways that it does is through healthcare. As with almost every other aspect of our lives, our societies, our economies, the health sector, the healthcare sector for that matter, relies quite heavily on power and energy to provide the healthcare services that we as citizens and communities rely on for our own health and well-being, whether it be through powering cold chains to deliver vaccines, whether it be through powering life-saving medical devices like oxygenators, ventilators. These examples are clearly kind of very important and in the context of our response to COVID-19. But power and energy are critical to other more regular kind of aspects of healthcare, whether it be powering computers and kind of that help us track medical records, that enable referrals, pumping water that keeps healthcare facilities clean and safe, whether it's lighting that enables and helps midwives to provide and all the quality healthcare services that we as a populace depend on. And the list goes on and on. I challenge our viewers to think of an aspect of your experience in a hospital that doesn't rely on power. But we often take this for granted. And I think it's because in many countries, including my own, we are fortunate enough to have 24/7 power. And so we often don't think about this. But this is not the case regions of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, where a large swath of the population live without power. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, a little less than 600 million Africans live without power. 1 in 4 healthcare facilities don't have power. 3 in 4 lack reliable power. And so this really represents a huge challenge among a variety of challenges that the healthcare sector faces in these resource-constrained environments to provide quality healthcare. And this is one part of the story around why you see huge disparities in health outcomes across countries like across regions like sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and the rest of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa alone is home to about 2/3 of all maternal deaths that occur worldwide. And the lack of power in healthcare facilities is one small but important part of why these health systems struggle to provide the quality healthcare services that we all rely on. So that's kind of why and how energy and power in particular are important to healthcare.
That's great. Can we elaborate a bit more on kind of the impact of COVID, especially that we know that it's not the first pandemic and it definitely won't be the last one in our lifetime at least. I think that we've had to weather some outbreaks of Ebola, of SARS, of others in the past. And I think that there are always some lessons learned, there are always some risks and opportunities that we're faced with. What I'm interested to know, Jam, is what are your thoughts on the lessons learned from facing this pandemic, and maybe how can we better prepare for the future?
That's a really good question. It's a really good question. And as you rightly point out, this is certainly not the first and it won't be the last pandemic. And I think our opportunity here is to try to learn from past experiences and this experience. And looking back at our response to Ebola in particular, I think there's a couple of things that we've learned that hopefully that we can apply and practice in our response to COVID-19. But this is still to be determined. And I would say there's two in particular. One is the development sector in particular is quite myopic. We are very reactive. And this is not surprising when there is an acute crisis like a pandemic. Obviously, the immediate focus is on containing and addressing the acute crisis. However, this often leads to underinvestment in long-term system building, particularly around health systems and building stronger, more resilient health systems. And as I just mentioned, energy has a critical role in that. And this kind of leads to the second learning, which is often we work and think in silos. If you look back at what happened during Ebola, there was, of course, a large spike in investment around the health system, or the traditional aspects of the health system as it related to containing and responding to Ebola. But there was a huge drop off in other sectors, including energy. And that continued well after the Ebola was contained. And so not only are we myopic, but then we kind of walk away from issues for an extended period of time and leave them underinvested, and are not making these connections between energy and health, or other, many other different kind of connections for that matter between energy and other aspects of development. So I think the two critical learnings is that we need to take a much longer term view towards investing in building stronger, more resilient healthcare systems. And that in itself is hugely important to addressing both acute crises like, the pandemic, but longer term systemic issues as well. And that energy is a really critical part of that story, and that we need to invest in the energy considerations of a healthcare response as well. So those are kind of some of the learnings that I think we've taken away from Ebola, and hopefully, and this is something that we're trying to do here at SE4All, is apply those learnings in the context of the COVID response.
Yeah, they sound like very solid steps, and I hope that governments and key players around the world will keep them in mind as well. Now, moving on to more of the work that you're doing with Sustainable Energy for All. I know that you have a goal of achieving universal electrification for healthcare facilities by 2030. Can you tell us a bit more about this goal, and also how you envision the roadmap and some of the success factors for achieving it?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And to clarify, our kind of goal of universal health electrification of healthcare facilities is actually really, while not explicitly made clear in Sustainable Development Goals, but it's really part of the Sustainable Development Goals 7 agenda, which states that by 2030 we should have universal energy access, including for electricity. And so we've kind of interpreted that and extended that agenda to critical social services like healthcare, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. And here we're at SE4All, we're trying to address this challenge of how to actually make sure that those 1 in 4 healthcare facilities that I mentioned earlier have the power they need, the 3 in 4 in sub-Saharan Africa that need reliable power, through actually an opportunity. And for us, the opportunity is namely distributed clean energy. And to kind of explain what I mean by that is, I'll say a little bit about, and I'm sure our viewers are clearly aware of how historically and traditionally we provide power to populations, and that's usually through extending the national grid. But for a variety of reasons, doing that in regions like sub-Saharan Africa, and particularly to rural and remote areas, is quite difficult. It's often not profitable for a utility to extend wires into a very rural, remote, often poor regions of a country. And out of that, a new industry has really been born, the off-grid industry. And this industry is leveraging innovations in technology, whether it's solar, batteries, innovations in business models and finance, to develop a suite of much smaller, more modular, distributed, and often renewable energy-based power systems that, in our view, are really well suited to the needs and the circumstances that many of these healthcare facilities find themselves. Again, especially in rural, remote parts of sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. These are the front lines of a healthcare system. They're providing primary healthcare. And so what we are trying to do at SC for All is see how we can promote and make use of this new industry, coupled with the traditional grid extension model to extend power to all these healthcare facilities by 2030. But we recognize that doing so it's not going to happen on its own. There are some important barriers that stand in the way. And I would kind of group them into two major buckets. The first of which is really a lack of prioritization, awareness, and investment in this issue. As I kind of said at the top, while it's quite intuitive that energy and healthcare are linked, these two sectors don't really operate in practice. They don't work together in practice. While intuitively they're quite linked, they don't work together in practice. There has been, for good reason, a lot of excitement and activity around more commercial applications of off-grid technologies, particularly amongst households in agriculture. But for social services that provide a public good, we see that it's underinvested. We're just not seeing as much investment in energy infrastructure for healthcare. So one of the things that we're trying to do is shine a light on this issue, both the challenge as well as the opportunity to drive investment, to drive further prioritization of this issue, both within the energy and the health sector. And we're doing that through data, through research, through advocacy. That's kind of our first goal at SC for All as it relates to how do we drive this agenda. The second is to make sure that once policymakers and investors understand the importance of investing in this issue, see the return on investment, that there are the business models, there are the technologies, there are the policies and standards in place to actually effectuate that change, to actually deliver solutions on the ground. The provision of off-grid power to rural, remote healthcare facilities is a relatively new challenge that requires often new business models, the tailoring of technology, making sure that that technology is designed for purpose, that these sectors are working together. And so all of these kind of enabling conditions need to be in place to actually deliver solutions once you have policymakers convinced of the utility of doing so. And that's the second bucket, part of the roadmap, is that we're working with partners and governments to design these business models, to design these innovative financing mechanisms, to shed a light on these emerging renewable energy, clean energy technologies that are increasingly or are known to the energy sector, but are often unknown to the health sector. It's an unfortunate circumstance that if you visit a Ministry of Health in, let's say, Liberia or some part of sub-Saharan Africa, often they take it for granted. They just kind of take it as a given that they don't have power. The health sector isn't as aware of all these innovations that are happening in the energy sector that could be leveraged to their benefit. So a lot of what we're doing is educating and kind of enabling this cross-sectoral dialogue. So that's what we're trying to do to take advantage of the opportunity.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, and I think it's great that it is in line with the SDGs, and it's helping all of us kind of reach that goal, but with a specific focus on healthcare sector, which is exactly what's needed in some of these areas that you were discussing. I think we've kind of tried to pick the brains of some of our young professionals. We talked about goals for 2030, but what I want to know now is what are your thoughts on how future energy leaders can shape the world, maybe make some changes, achieve things in the lead up to 2050?
Wow, that's a great question. Look, I think to me, this is such an exciting time and critical time to be working on energy. There are some massive challenges ahead of us in the way of obviously combating climate change, transforming our energy systems to a low carbon system, making sure that those systems are equitable, that everyone around the world has access to power to drive their economies. So I think there's, a lot of really important agendas that young professionals can certainly become part of. I think what's exciting as well is there's huge opportunities and excitement and innovations around technology in particular that I think we're already seeing drive kind of this agenda. And so this wasn't necessarily true when I was a young professional. I think what led me to work on these issues, which I think still obviously holds true today probably more than any other time, is the human link between energy and other issues, the link between energy and other kind of more social issues, whether it be development, poverty reduction, equity, gender, women's empowerment. These are all issues that are really tightly woven with energy, but we often don't think about it, or at least we don't rarely hear about energy in these kind of contexts. We often think about energy as a technology based issue. And so I think there's ample ways of getting young professionals involved in this sector beyond just a traditional technology-centric avenue, which in itself I think is incredibly exciting. I'm an engineer by background. It certainly got me excited. But there's all these other socioeconomic aspects, geopolitical aspects of energy that I think almost, regardless who you are, what your background is, you could probably relate. And that's what I find, exciting about energy, and hopefully I would think are some really interesting hooks for young professionals who are navigating kind of this, their careers and trying to figure out kind of how they want to contribute. Massive-ish challenges, mandates to be part of, and really a lot of exciting innovations to also drive as the solutions. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be a young professional in the energy sector.
I might be putting you on the spot a bit here, but if I were to ask you to give one piece of advice to young professionals who are just in their careers today, what would that be?
Oh, look, this is such a challenging time to be a young professional in general. So it's hard to say, what advice I'd give. I think as I look back on my career, I think being just open-minded, to different paths, off-ramps in your career. I certainly remember as a young professional thinking I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my career. And looking back, there were a lot of bends in the road. And I think being flexible and open-minded is going to be increasingly important in a world that is rapidly evolving and will, probably evolve much more rapidly over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years than it did at the beginning of my career. So I think young professionals, there's probably a lot of different advice, but my advice would be, remain hungry, but remain really flexible and open-minded, because the world is going to look very different 10, 15 years from now than it does today. And one needs to be adaptive in that world. So
I love that. I love that. I agree as well. I think that's very good advice. Thank you, Jem, for your advice, for sharing your thoughts, and for just being here with us today. It was a pleasure to have you, and I hope that we can have more conversations in the future with you.
No, thank you for the opportunity to talk about these really important issues that are close to my heart. I appreciate it.